All right. So I'm one of the leads of the PSA Stereotype Threat Project, PSA005. This project has been, I don't know, like 3 or 4 years in the making because it got interrupted by, well, the fucking plague. So I'm really excited to talk about it because I think it's a unique PSA project. It's not going for the cross-national diversity of participants like many of the projects. Instead, it's using the PSA in a slightly different way, which solves a unique problem for this research literature. So I'll tell you about that and give you a bit of the background. We don't have data yet, so I can't show you any preliminary results. We have some data, but it's not enough to, say anything interesting or substantial yet. But I'll talk about the progress of the project as well. So the purpose of the project is to investigate this thing called stereotype threat. This is defined by researchers as a feeling of threat that arises from the possibility of confirming a negative group stereotype. And according to the theory, it could be any group stereotype at all. So if you have this idea or this awareness that I don't know. So as a white man in the United States, I guess there's a stereotype that white men can't dance. Hypothetically, that could produce stereotype threat. It's a very flexible idea that could apply to any group, any stereotype. There are by now hundreds of studies of this, not only because of the flexibility that I just mentioned, but also because stereotype threat has some really interesting applications to pretty big social problems. And that's probably where most of the interest in stereotype threat arises, not from the stereotypes that are a little bit silly, but from the ones that are pretty consequential. It is an idea actually that has shown up in policy relevant documents. So probably the most interesting application of stereotype threat, at least in the United States, is to the achievement gap between Black and white students. There's a stereotype that Black people are unintelligent. If Black students are feeling stereotype threat, that could provide one explanation for that achievement gap. Perhaps it's not due to any sort of difference in ability, but due to the fact that there are certain situations that are relevant to the unintelligent stereotype that trigger these feelings of threat, and that makes it hard to perform well on high stakes tests, for example. So just to show you the policy relevance, this is a pretty famous Supreme Court case in the United States, Forscher versus the University of Texas. And one of the briefs that was cited in the Supreme Court decision mentions stereotype threat right here. A bunch of social psychologists got together and provided some expert testimony that one of the reasons for this was about the affirmative action, which has a lot to do with the achievement gap. And so one of the explanations given for the achievement gap is that the stereotype threat. There's this process that is triggered by the possibility of confirming a negative group stereotype. And that's the thing that produces a performance gap. And if that's true, that would also provide some justification for something like affirmative action, which is meant to overcome some of the opportunity loss that occurs due to stereotype threat. So this is a really big deal. This is one of those theories that in social psychology that has a lot of potential practical application. And that's one of the things that makes it really interesting to me, not just me, but to other people as well. If stereotype threatism is a real phenomenon, we should have good evidence of it, and that good evidence could then be leveraged to, try to overcome it. But one of the unfortunate aspects of stereotype threat is that, like many studies and like many theories in social psychology, the evidence, I think, is a bit weaker than I'd want for something with such broad implications. And I really see two big challenges to research on stereotype threat. One is low precision, the precision problem. So a lot of studies in stereotype threat are really quite small. In a meta-analysis that I'm doing with the co-lead of this project, Valerie Taylor, the median number of participants in a given stereotype threat study is 52. Typically, this is two groups design, between subjects design. So you're talking about 25 participants per group. But some of these studies use more groups than that. There are 3-group and 4-group and 5-group designs. And all of that goes into that, contributes to the data that median N is based on. I think there are good reasons for why the median N is small. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the interest in stereotype threat focuses on hard to reach groups. So for example, I mentioned one of the big policy applications of stereotype threat research is to understanding the community achievement gap between Black and white students. If you're doing studies with Black participants, only about 6% of the student body at research active institutions in the United States is Black. So if you're a researcher trying to do a stereotype threat study and you're drawing from a participant pool where 6% of the participants are your population of interest, it's going to take a long time to conduct any high-powered research with that population. So it's understandable, but of course that doesn't make a difference in terms of interpreting the strength of the evidence. The evidence is the evidence. It's still quite weak, and it brings all the problems of low precision to the problems of inference about stereotype threat. So that problem that I just mentioned, that's true of a lot of social psychology, of course. Stereotype threat is no exception. This next problem, I think, is a little bit more specific to stereotype threat. So I mentioned how, stereotype threat, the idea is quite flexible, in that there are a lot of ways to think about, there are a lot of different stereotypes that could be relevant. There are a lot of different groups that could experience stereotype threat. But there are also a lot of ways to trigger stereotype threat. So according to theory, all that's necessary is a reminder of a group stereotype, but reminders could come in lots of different forms. So I think it's going to help to go through an example to see like how this problem poses a challenge from a research perspective. Usually in stereotype threat studies, you have one group of participants that experiences some sort of procedure that is designed to reduce feelings of threat or reduce the probability of experiencing them. And that's compared to a group of participants who experiences something to increase feelings of threat. But there are lots of ways to do this. So the threat decreasing group could experience something like they're told that the test that they're about to take, which is like maybe a standard SAT test, or maybe it's an IQ test, they're told that past research shows that there are no IQ differences on it, or no group differences on this test. That's one of the common manipulations. But sometimes the reminder is a lot more subtle than that. So in some studies, people literally just circle their race on a demographic sheet. That's supposed to serve as a reminder of their race. And for Black students, that's supposed to trigger ideas that are related to race, one of which is that Black students are unintelligent. There are lots of these different manipulations, and the same thing goes with the threat increasing group. So I'm showing you 4 different categories of threat decreasing procedures and threat increasing procedures. And the important thing to bear in mind here for this idea of different operationalizations is that any one of these different threat decreasing procedures could, in theory, be compared to any one of these threat increasing procedures. You can just choose one of each and come up with your operationalization, your comparison between threat decreasing and threat increasing groups. So if you do the math, that results in 16 different operationalizations. Remember, these are all categories of operationalizations or procedures. So within this procedure that I called make task non-diagnostic, there are lots of different ways to do that. So the number of combinations is actually much larger than 16. Another complication is that researchers sometimes take elements of each of these different categories and combine them. So you might both make a task non-diagnostic by saying, hey, this thing that looks like an IQ test, it doesn't measure intelligence at all. That would be something that makes the task non-diagnostic. And they might try to say, well, there are no deep group differences on this task. That would be the refute group differences procedure. So sometimes they do both. So I can like mix and match across all of these different procedures to come up with my own custom threat decreasing and threat increasing groups. And if you do the math, that results in another 28 different operationalizations. But it gets even more complicated because I can also mix and match across the threat decreasing and threat increasing categories. Sometimes researchers they make the task non-diagnostic, but then they also claim that there are group differences on that task. And then that's compared to a group that only claims group differences. So you have one procedure that's designed to decrease feelings of threat, that's sort of smushed together with a procedure that increases feelings of threat, and that's compared to a procedure that just increases feelings of threat. It happens sometimes. So if you do the math, that results in another, in 224 different ways to operationalize stereotype threat. It's really a lot. And that does not even count. Sometimes researchers just take two threat increasing conditions. One of them is supposed to be more extreme than the other. So that's yet more ways to operationalize stereotype threat. You can see how if you take these basic categories and you mix and match them enough, because you're trying to do different things in research, that results in a lot of different ways to operationalize stereotype threat in your study. And in some ways, this is like, this can be an asset in terms of research because it does increase the possibility to generalize across different ways of operationalizing stereotype threat. But if it's done in a very ad hoc way, or if it's done in very low precision studies, as I just showed you it is, that also increases the amount of uncertainty pretty substantially. Because how can you really be sure that one operationalization is doing the same thing as another? You can't unless you gather strong evidence about it. So these two features combined, I think they're both understandable where they come from. It's understandable that if you're doing research with a rare population, some of your studies are going to have lower precision than they might otherwise would. It's also understandable that if you have a very flexible concept, you mix and match different ways of instantiating the concept. But if you do that in kind of in a way with low precision studies in a way that's a little bit ad hoc, it does make it harder to draw strong scientific inferences. These are both features of stereotype threat research, and in my view, there are reasons why, well, it increases the amount of scientific uncertainty behind an idea that really is quite important and has quite important policy implications. So these are the two main challenges that I see in stereotype threat research: low precision and varying operationalizations of stereotype threat. The project PSA005 takes these observations as a starting point and tries to leverage the psychological science accelerator and some unique features of the accelerator to tackle both of these problems at once, to provide really strong evidence one way or the other for or against stereotype threat. Of course, any one study, it's only one study, but the purpose here is to have a really strong study that provides at least a starting place for a good evidence base, especially about Black students in the US, which, as I already mentioned, is one of the most interesting policy applications of this idea. One thing I should mention, though, that's kind of interesting and also relevant to the design of this study is that there's not universal agreement about how much these features are a problem. So stereotype threat is also a particularly contentious research topic with very strong disagreements across competing camps. That also makes it hard to come to an agreement about well, just what the evidence means in general. So this is also a feature that we try to leverage, I guess, in the study. So I'm going to get a little bit more specific now about how the design tries to tackle these different challenges. And we really do try to leverage the PSA a lot in this design. So with the precision problem, this is something that's kind of familiar about the PSA, but most PSA studies try to leverage the global network of the PSA to gather a lot more cultural diversity than is typical in a particular study. This, the Stereotype Threat Project is a bit unique in that all of our sites are located in the United States. We're interested in Black students in the United States. But what we try to do is we try to get each researcher at their different sites to commit to recruiting maybe just a few Black students. We're still dealing with that 6% of the student body at research active institutions. But if you add that up across, say, 20 or 30 researchers, suddenly you're talking about a pretty good sample. So instead of going wide across a bunch of different countries with very different participant populations, we're trying to go deep. We're trying to leverage the network in one particular area in the United States and get each of the researchers who are involved to devise their own recruitment plan to recruit the few students, Black students who are at their institution. And maybe that only results in a sample of 20, 30, whatever. But if you've got 30 or 40 of those sites, you can still get a pretty good sample. And that's essentially the one of the big assets, I think, of the PSA that maybe is also a little bit underused in other studies. I think this is an idea that can be applied to other rare populations. And I hope to see more of this kind of study in the future. So our in principle commitments by all of our sites is about 2,700. Our criterion is 2,000. It's a little bit, there's a bit of a complication here, but we did tell Nature Human Behavior, the journal we're working with, that we're going to get at least 2,000 participants. And we've got a pretty good mix of sites at public and private institutions with varying proportions of Black students in the student body and across the different regions in the United States. So that's the precision problem, even though we're going about, we're using the PSA to a different purpose to recruit a rare population in one region. We're still, using the PSA to get a big sample, right? And that's something that a lot of other studies try to do in the PSA. The way we tackle the generalizability problem is a little bit unique to this study. And that is we're using in this particular design methods technique called an adaptive design. The principle behind this is that if you have like a 6-condition study, a typical design would assign 1/6 of the participants to each condition. So the participants would be evenly spread across those 6 different conditions. That means that if you're focusing on any one comparison between 2 of those groups, you lose a lot of precision. So in other words, that comparison between group A and group B is a lot less precise than if you only had a 2-condition study, because suddenly your 600 participants are spread across those 2 groups, 100, 100, as opposed to going 300, 300 spread across 2 groups. What an adaptive design tries to do is that you can start with that really large design with like 6 conditions or 8 conditions or whatever you choose. And at first, everybody is assigned evenly to each of those conditions, 1/6 probability to each condition. But over time, you progressively reanalyze the data to see which comparison between conditions is providing the strongest evidence of the condition difference. And the probability that someone gets assigned to those 2 groups gets progressively updated up. So at time 1, you might have 1/6 probability to get assigned to each place, but at time 2, maybe condition A and condition B are showing some evidence of the threat effect. So instead of the probabilities being 1/6, there may be 1/5 or 1/4. And over time, the stronger the evidence is that there's a condition difference at those 2 places, the higher the probability will be of people getting assigned to those 2 groups. So that you're sort of splitting the difference between the efficiency that you'd get if you had just a 2-group design with those 2 conditions that do show a difference, and the full 6-condition design where you have 1/6 probability only of getting assigned to those 2 conditions. So at the end, maybe you don't have a 50-50 probability of being assigned to the 2 conditions where there is a difference, but maybe it's like, 0.3 and 0.3 in those 2 conditions. And actually, we have some simulation evidence that this kind of adaptive design arrives at a strong evidence much faster than a non-adaptive design. And the efficiency gains are really quite large. And the reason this is nice is it allows us to test a variety of different operationalizations of stereotype threat all at once. And I already went through how we're dealing with this, where we're working with a hard-to-reach population. So it allows us to use their data and frankly their time in a much more efficient way than we otherwise could. So I also think it's a bit more, well, it's respectful of the fact that we're dealing with this hard-to-reach population. It's also more respectful of the participants' time. So there's a bit of an ethical dimension to this as well. This is just showing towards the end, if we're dealing with this condition difference that's only showing up in one place in the design. This is showing how in the adaptive design, you get close to that 50-50 probability of being assigned to just those 2 conditions. You can see that this reddish line is arriving towards the 50-50 mark. That's just showing, it's sort of splitting that difference between the traditional design with just 2 conditions and the traditional design with 6 conditions. You get the benefit of testing all the different things at once, and you also get the greater efficiency of getting strong evidence for against an effect that you would get with that 50-50 design. These are the different conditions that we're using in this study. The way we arrived at these is basically through consultation with a bunch of different threat researchers and looking through a bunch of different threat studies and trying to provide a good representation of the different procedures that people actually use. And you can see there we're using manipulations in these different categories that I mentioned earlier, making the task diagnostic versus non-diagnostic, doing that race priming procedure where you have people think about their race before going into a task, and either refuting or invoking group differences on the upcoming task that the participants are about to do. The last kind of interesting, unique feature of this study that also leverages the broad connections that we get both through the PSA and through mostly the co-lead on this project, Valerie's network. She's connected to a lot of stereotype threat researchers, is diversity in priors about stereotype threat. I mentioned that this is a very contentious research area. And we actually try to make that an asset in a way during the design process. So we actively solicited feedback from any stereotype threat researcher we could contact. And we incorporated their feedback into the design even before we ran the study. So you could think of this as sort of a process of consensus design. If you're familiar with Nick Coles's Many Smiles study, this is using a similar idea, although we didn't go the full way to having like a big board of design experts. But we did get the design feedback before we submitted the project to Nature Human Behavior. Okay, I think the benefits of the PSA are really substantial in this project, and I just don't think we could have done it without the PSA. But I do want to comment briefly on a couple unique challenges that aren't specific to this study, but I think do come out in the progress that we've made along the way to implementing the study. One is just the administration of this study has been pretty challenging, as it is with a lot of multi-site studies. The basic problem, I think, is that in this study and in other studies in the PSA, there's just a lot of coordination. I mean, it's just like basic things like keeping on top of email, also tracking IRB applications, letting people test the, this is implemented as an online study that is delivered in person in, private cubicles, like a lot of stereotype threat research. But the testing process of making sure that the link is working for everybody, that everybody actually has private cubicles, and we have images of that. It's just hard to track all of that stuff. And you need dedicated labor to do that, and that labor needs to be compensated in some way. So how do you compensate these people? I think that's like a basic question in a lot of big team science research. This is just giving you a taste of the different coordination burdens, the various stuff that you need to do to get all this done. This is this is some instructions for the IRB process, which is a little bit involved because in some IRBs got a little bit skittish because we're working with this rare population, and some IRBs consider the threat procedure to be potentially harmful. I don't think it's bad that it goes through that kind of vetting, but it does make the IRB process complicated. We have a detailed tracking system to get through all of this. You can see these dates are a while ago because, we had to deal with the plague. Someone needs to set up the system and monitor it. That's the coordination burden on the ethics side. A related problem, closely related to the administrative, the problem of having a big administrative burden, is that there needs to be some way of assigning credit for different kinds of tasks. Ideally, all of the all of the credit for this project does not go to, well, just me. I mean, first of all, I'm not even the only lead on this project. Valerie Taylor is the other co-lead. But also there's just like a lot of technical and challenging stuff that has to happen in this project. And I didn't do all of it. I did some of it, but I'd really like other people to be recognized for this too, especially people who might be early in their career, going on the job market. It's really important that those people get recognized for the amazing contributions that they made to this project. So like many other PSA projects, so I'm showing you the main administrative team here. All these people made huge contributions, and it would be nice to make those visible. So like a lot of PSA projects, this project is using the credit system. This is the idea of listing specific contributions that aren't just names on a paper, but that actually say, like, this person did the formal analysis. They helped implement this adaptive design procedure, or this person did some of the administration, which was very involved in this project. So the basic idea is to be a little bit more specific about which contributions each person did and make them visible in some way. It is challenging to do this because journals can be a little bit restrictive with how contributions are listed in the journal, if they allow them at all. But Nature Human Behavior at least uses this credit as sort of a standard system. It's trying to be standardized and applicable across journals. And that's what we're using for the Stereotype Threat project. So the whole idea behind this is, instead of just names, you actually learn, okay, Valerie Taylor on the upper left is the co-lead, and so helped with conceptualization, material supervision, administration, really everything. Neil Lewis, who's next to Valerie, even though he's not listed formally as a co-lead, has been very involved at all stages of this project and also helped with conceptualization and almost everything. Aaron Buchanan, next to Neil, is a fucking wizard, and did a lot of basically all of the software stuff and implementing the back end of the adaptive design, which was really quite involved. Heather Uri has been invaluable with software and validation. Dan Cavanero implemented the adaptive design, like the formal parts of that, which, as I mentioned earlier, has been critical for this project. So that's a huge contribution. And then Bharathi in the lower right has been our project manager and has just been stellar at all parts. So I'm hoping with this system, the more the PSA can push the idea of contributorship, the more these more fine-grained contributions can be recognized. I think that's really important for the sustainability of this project, but for really all big team science projects. The last challenge that I want to mention is just the speed of this project. I'm not sure it's reasonable to expect a project that involves data collection across many different regions, even within the US, to go fast. I just don't think that that's reasonable unless you have like lots of money to make it happen. But still, the process has been time consuming. This project is I think it's at least 3 years in the making. And that's all to say, if you take on a project that is of sufficient complexity, it's going to take some time. And that's been true here. That's going to be true in a lot of other big team science projects as well. So we had hoped to start data collection last year, but then the plague hit and threw a wrench in everybody's plans. And that was especially challenging for this project because a lot of stereotype threat research does exclusively in-person data collection. And we, the project team, decided that that was an important aspect of this project especially because one of the manipulations that's used to operationalized stereotype threat is to have the experimenter be like mean or rude and have them be a member of a different race or group. So a white experimenter in the case of a Black participant. So that it just seemed like that in-person experience was important enough in other stereotype threat studies that we should respect that here as well. But that meant, unless we wanted to get people sick, and we really didn't want to do that, we just couldn't collect data for about a year. Now that vaccination is more prevalent and we know a bit more about the mechanisms of action of the coronavirus, we have felt confident enough to launch data collection, but we're not as far along as we expected for understandable reasons. But I'll share with you where we are. As of yesterday, I just checked this yesterday, we have 168 participants, which I think is pretty fucking cool. I'm really jazzed that we're finally seeing those participants come in. Aaron's been making a Shiny app to help monitor data collection. It's not ready for launch to the full project team yet. It will be eventually. One of the reasons we want to do this is to help. We need to track which site each participant comes from. Sometimes that information gets lost because it's not entered during the experimenter process. One of the reasons we're doing this is to help identify which sites participants come from if we're missing that information. We're also using this to monitor. We want to make sure that different sites are not collecting data, not dominating data collection all at once. So if we're thinking about Cornell University, we want to make sure that at any given time, we're not just relying on data from Cornell University, because the algorithm is learning and changing the condition assignment probabilities. And if Cornell is very different from some of the other sites, then we don't want it to overlearn based on the characteristics of Cornell. This is just one of those weird coordination things that we have to think about here that isn't as relevant in other projects. So this tracker helps us monitor things like that, helps us monitor just the status of data collection, but also things like this phenomenon of clumping. And eventually, it will also show the state of the evidence. So that's something I don't think it matters if the project team knows this, as long as maybe we don't want the experimenters to know it. The data collection script is already written, and in fact, the data is being reanalyzed at different points during the process. So there's not really a possibility of that knowledge influencing our analysis decisions. So we'll also be able to monitor how the probabilities of getting assigned to different conditions using this Shiny app. We'll start seeing some adaptation of the algorithm at 180 participants. And as I mentioned before, we're going to continue to collect data until we reach at least 2,000 participants. That might mean that we're collecting data through fall of next year. Basically, we'll take each semester as it comes and see where our progress is at. We've also done a little bit on the meta science of stereotype threat. I mentioned a couple times how this is a very contentious research area, and I think this could be an interesting opportunity to learn how people think about stereotype threat theory and how people think about psychological theories in general, and also how people respond to evidence as it comes in. This is a sort of an add-on project to this. We launched a survey of how the various members of the project team think about stereotype threat. And what we want to know is things like, do we see that variability in beliefs about different aspects of the theory? How is that, how are those beliefs connected with beliefs in real world disparities? I think that's the most interesting part of stereotype threat research. That's what got me interested in it. it'd be nice to know just something about that idea in general, the connection between reasoning about scientific evidence and real world problems. And what we hope to do is do another wave of the survey after the results are in to see if beliefs have shifted. We might not have enough researchers in the project team to say anything very definitive about this, but I still think it's interesting, even as a case study where the evidence is a little bit more uncertain. I still think it's there's quite some interesting topics here. So that's basically where we're at. So I welcome any questions where I can go into more depth about the project. I've also left a link here to the preprint of the protocol that's accepted by Nature Human Behavior, and a link to these slides if you want to go through them on the OSF. So thanks for your attention, and I welcome any questions. Or not, because there's just two of you. It could just be an informal conversation, wherever you all like.
Sorry, busy tweeting.
Oh, no worries. Savannah, you can ask questions too if you want.
Trying to think of, I had one and I can't remember what it is. So it'll come back to me.
No problem.
I just want to say how incredibly cool all this is.
Thanks.
Absolutely love the adaptive design aspect. Did you have to, did Nature Human Behavior in the registered report process ask you to do like a power analysis? Or did you have to develop any methods to figure out what's going on with this kind of new?
We did. Yeah, we did. Actually, we did this before we went to Nature Human Behavior, and that's why I recruited Dan Cavanero onto the project early on. So I forget where I had learned about this. I think I was at like a methods-focused conference or something, and I've been thinking about this problem of like different operationalizations. This is one of my contributions to the project, so I can say I. Whereas a lot of other things are not me. Yeah, I've been thinking about this this problem, and the adaptation seemed like a nice solution. But like I had no idea how to do any of the simulations to like figure out if this would actually, this actually was as promising as I thought it was. But this is like Dan's area of research. So he basically did a pretty extensive simulation study that is in the preprint as well as the supplements. And we could not have gone forward without him. So even though he's doing less now that we're at project launch, man, his contributions were critical. We couldn't have done the project without him. So if you're interested in, yeah, go ahead.
It seems to be a theme across PSA studies that the methodologists are indispensable.
I agree 100%. And Dan was so helpful and so responsive to feedback and collaboration. And so if you read through the preprint and the supplements, you'll see we have basically a full simulation study. And one of the like cool little nuggets of information that we learned in this study is that so the adaptive design, it's designed to optimize for finding positive evidence. In other words, if there is a difference hidden in these sets of conditions, we want to have the best chances of finding it. So there was a possibility that it would be worse at making definitive statements that we have null results. That was a possibility. but we looked at that possibility, and actually you get a little bit of extra efficiency with the adaptive design, and you also get a lower error rate. And that was a bit of a puzzle, but what seems to be happening is that if, say, in conditions A and B, in the population, there is no true difference, but just due to sampling error, you get a slight positive difference at like 180 or 200 participants. Well, people will have a higher probability of being assigned to those two conditions. So the adaptive design sort of compensates for that and does almost like a micro experiment. It's like, okay, I think there's a difference here. Let's get some more evidence in that for those two conditions and see if that holds up. So it's almost like it does a pseudo replication in a way. That means that you have a lower false positive rate with this particular type of design.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you've got a false positive because of low n, then it's going to dump more n in there, and then that should even out. But it won't address, like, if there are confounds in one of your methods that are causing a positive result. So I guess there's, yeah, still a fair amount to do in terms of like just assessing with our brains. Then when you find out what are the most sort of efficient methods, making sure that they're not confounded.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this, so there are a couple places where using the adaptive design has added some extra complication that wouldn't have already been there. The other place is this possibility of systematic differences at different sites. That's something that we had to think a lot about. The danger is, for example, I think it's Florida International University has a pretty large pool of Black participants because it's one of those historically Black institutions. So if all of our participants were coming from Florida International, right when the algorithm was starting to learn, there's this danger that like maybe stereotype threat is not as strong there. So there's no adaptation, and that creates some weirdness or inefficiency in the algorithm. So the fact that we're doing only in-person data collection is actually a bit nice for lowering the possibility of that kind of clumping, because the participants are naturally spaced out across institutions. So that's something we're trying to monitor with the Shiny app. But I could imagine that that's more of a concern for other studies. So as with any new method, of course, think through if it suits the problem that you want to solve with it. I think here the adaptive design is like super helpful and is another thing that makes the project possible. But like any other method, it's not a cure-all. I also, I think it would be cool to see this method used elsewhere, because I think the potential is there and the efficiency gains are there. So it'd be nice to see this catch on a little bit as a result of this project and as a result of the code that Dan wrote and that Aaron helped, that Aaron basically implemented. No worries, Lisa. Savannah, did you remember the question that you want to ask?
Yeah, I just had a simple question of how mixed race participants play into your study.
Yeah, it's not simple at all. We are allowing mixed race participants basically because of the history of the one drop rule in the United States. Mixed race people are perceived as Black. So we thought that the experience would likely be similar, but we do have, I didn't talk about the additional measures that we have in this study. So we have, for example, some measurement of, ancestry. So which are your grandparents from like West Africa, or are they from Haiti or other regions? If we have this large group of Black participants, this is an opportunity to learn about their experiences and whether any of these factors matter for the experience of stereotype threat or any of the other variables that we've collected, frankly. So there's also a lot of potential for secondary analysis once we have this, this data set. We also measure racial identification. There's this inventory called, I think it's called the MIPI or something. Anyway, we're measuring that, and as well as mixed race identification. So I think there's a lot of potential here to learn more about, you know, some of those issues of racial identity and whether they affect the experience of stereotype threat or something else that's in the project.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had somebody actually email me like last night about it because I'm on our Sona, and I was like, I actually don't feel like I know the answer to this. So
As long as they say we have that question that we sent that has the census categories for race and ethnicity. So as long as they check that they're, I think it's called African American in the census categories, they're eligible.
well, thank you for giving a talk even to just like us. It was very informal.
Yeah, no, but that's also a nice way to learn about the project. Cool. Well, any other questions? Thanks, everybody.